have a great conviction that fiction is a very legitimate way of truth-telling, which most people don't immediately accept. But there's a writer, Dorothy Allison, who has a wonderful quote. She says, "Fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives." And I get impatient with people who say, "Oh, I don't read fiction, it's not serious." I say, what about Uncle Tom's Cabin? It ended slavery in this country. So, I mean, there's an aspect to fiction that is very appealing, in that when fiction works, it's because you've accessed some kind of truth, which is not to say nonfiction doesn't do that. So I always loved fiction. I got sidetracked into 2 nonfiction books. But to tell a story that had the elements that I wanted in it, and to be about medicine, I thought there was just no other way to do it other than in a big epic medical novel. One of my editors, my only editor, at the end of the book, she said, when I got to the last line, I suddenly realized that your whole book was about separation. It was about displacement. Every situation ultimately could be boiled down to separation, displacement, which are themes that have been important in my own personal life, but also in my, in my sort of political, geographical, nationhood life. So, I think that books ultimately are very revealing about the author sometimes, and only the author sometimes recognizes the profound degree to which that is true. I had the title before I had anything else. It's a title that I liked because it had a certain ring to it. It's a phrase that occurs in the Hippocratic Oath. We say, and the great joy of my professional life is once a year to stand with the medical students as they stand and take the oath. And when they take the oath, they invite everyone in the audience who's a physician to stand with them. So parents, siblings, sometimes a child is standing as the father or mother graduates, and all the professors, all of us who are the physicians who taught them, we stand. It's a very moving moment, and in that oath there's this ancient line, "I will not cut for stone." And it has a strange ring to it because it's not applicable to today. And what that line refers to is there was a time when bladder stones were epidemic, kidney stones. We don't quite know why. Bad water, contaminants. I mean, children would die in agony. Infants, they couldn't pee with rock-sized, stones in their bladder. Samuel Johnson wore a catheter in his top hat and catheterized himself 5-6 times a day. Agonies. And there were people who had learned to cut and take these stones out, either from cutting above the pelvic bone or cutting in front of the anal region and yanking these stones out. And it was a skill passed on from, one tradesman to another. Very, very dangerous. And when they were done, they would wipe their knife on their cassock and move off to the next city. And mortality was huge. And so there was this prescription in the Hippocratic Oath, thou shalt not cut for stone. And I liked that. It just had an ancient ring to it. It rang of surgery. My main character's name was Stone. So I think titles, when they work, should be mysterious, and the reader doesn't quite know, but as you read through the book, it begins to echo and a sense of why that title emerges. Is there anybody who's not fascinated by nuns? I mean, there's something, I think, inherently completely fascinating about nuns to me as a child. Not that I was particularly around nuns a lot, but the whole idea of someone who has made this contract, a woman who has made a contract to shun the world and have this special relationship as a bride of Christ and don a garment that is emblematic of this sacrifice. It was a curious form of sexuality in the fact that it was calling attention to sexuality by its denial of sexuality. So I think we're all intrigued by nuns. I'd like to think this is not a private fetish of mine. I'd like to think that everyone is intrigued by nuns. And when a nun fails in her vow, we don't delight in it. We, far from it. I think we don't delight in it, but we actually have a sense of their humanness, that they have failed only because they are, after all, human like us. And like us, we aspire to many things, and we, it's good to aspire, and we don't often succeed. And the ones who succeed, we're very, very, admiring of. The ones who fail, in a funny way, I think theirs is a more powerful message. They speak of the human desire to achieve. They speak of our obsession with with the idea of faith and a higher being. So, that's my fascination. And I couldn't think of anything more fascinating than the idea of beginning a book with a nun who is in extremis in labor, and one of the children is going to be the narrator for the story. It had me going, so I was hoping that it would have the reader going too. I saw Bernini's sculpture when I'd finished the book, even though, as you say, it's a central part of the book. But I had seen the picture of this incredible statue and read descriptions of it, and there's a great example of the denial of of one's womanly life on earth with a man. In a funny way, attracts and speaks to a sexuality that otherwise wouldn't merit a second glance. And Bernini chose to depict this moment of the angel coming to Saint Teresa. It is a frankly, if not erotic, it's certainly an eroticized encounter. And I think that's a statue, that's an image that millions have seen, and it's almost something we associate with Saint Teresa. I was intrigued by it, and I could picture a small boy who had lost his mother, who was a nun. I could picture the boy being absolutely drawn to that. I must say I went with some trepidation to see the image, to see the church where the statue resides, and I was certain that I would be somewhat underwhelmed. Instead of which I was overwhelmed. It was just amazing. It almost brought me to my knees, the idea that a human mind could conceive and then execute this and light it with basically a window in the roof of this very modest church. And it wasn't even the dominant statue in the church. There were others that were even more elaborate, but this was incredible. And I felt a great sense of there must have been something important about this image for it to settle in my psyche that way. And I was so glad that I used it the way I did. Well, I was brought up in a very Orthodox Indian Christian community, a part of India where we believe that St. Thomas the Apostle landed before St. Peter came to Rome. So it's a very, Orthodox kind of faith, a language called Syriac, which, is used for the liturgy. And as a child, that was reproduced in our church in Ethiopia, because almost all the teachers who taught in Ethiopia were hired by the emperor from this one state. And so I found the whole thing quite mysterious, completely opaque to me. I don't know Syriac, but turns out neither did my parents. And yet this was a very familiar liturgy to them, and we were dragged to these services. I think it really, in many ways, turned me off from religion, because it felt so oppressive on a Sunday to be put through this. And it's taken, I think, this long to come back to it. And I actually had the pleasure of attending a church service exactly like the one I did as a child. So I think the religious atmosphere I grew up in, I think, had a lot to do with my interest in religion in this book. But I wasn't around missionaries that much, but they were very evident. They were everywhere in a country like Ethiopia. And you had to wonder sometimes whether the entire notion of being a missionary and bringing faith to people who already had the faith centuries before these missionaries bring the faith, whether there's any sort of, if it isn't comic at some level. I found it slightly comic, and yet I found the earnestness of the endeavor of the missionaries to be very much worthy of admiration. So it was a mix of being misguided in their intent, and yet doing powerful work, and some of them being very practical, some of them being completely lacking any sense of propriety. I think Barbara Kingsolver showed some of that in her book that had to do with a similar bringing faith to the masses. I was more interested in the medical aspects of things, because one of the precious things missionaries have done all over the world is bring medical care in the context of the service of religion, which I think was a wonderful blending of two very related things, the ministry of healing and the ministry of Christ, or whatever religion they were bringing. So this was my invention, but I'm sure it's not far-fetched, where well-intentioned people send Bibles to the third world, not recognizing that no one reads to begin with, and if they could read, they wouldn't read that particular language. So the Bible as an instrument of assistance and help in a country like that would be, not at all helpful. It winds up just being dead wood, even though the Bibles were actually, received as very holy objects, completely mysterious to the owner, but still something of great value. So I had a little, story around that, and I exaggerated these Bibles flooding out of rooms, just, Bibles, Bibles, Bibles. That's what matron was getting when what she wanted was food and medicine and drugs. But I think I was getting at something you always feel when you work in the third world, and I'm sure you've sensed this too, that, what's needed is not physicians or, what's needed essentially is money. That the great disease out there so often is poverty. The disease like rheumatic fever cannot take hold unless there's also crowding and lack of sanitation and so on. Those are the conditions under which these diseases flourish, and to give penicillin for rheumatic fever addresses that problem, but it doesn't reverse the larger problem, which is one of poverty. And I think many people come to that slowly in the third world. They come to that sense of, and by third world I'm using a term I use in the book, they come to that sense of ultimately what was needed was not so much Christ or Bibles, but what was needed was Christ's love and money and political reform and all the other things that are fundamental to a good life. The kind of medicine that I was drawn to, my desire to be a physician, had a lot to do with that sense of medicine as a ministry of healing, not just a science, and not even just a science and an art, but also a calling, also a ministry. And I think if it's not a popular idea within physician circles, it certainly is an idea that resonates with patients. That is the kind of physician I think most of us want to see. And I've become very, very caught up in that idea. I think more and more we're dealing with patients with chronic disease, especially in this country. And there's only so much you can do. The dramatic reversals of their symptoms and signs, that it doesn't happen for everybody. That doesn't happen for the great majority. And the physician-patient relationship then becomes one of somehow conveying to them that you will not abandon them, giving them the strength to go on, giving them the sense that if they lack the strength, you will be there to help. That is in so many ways what the pastor also winds up doing. I don't mean to make too much of that, but I do believe that that aspect of medicine has been greatly jeopardized in the Western Hemisphere. And the science model has taken over with dramatic success, huge success. I don't mean to take away from that, but I do think that patients still very much require that one-on-one encounter. The Samaritan function, as a famous physician used to talk about it. The Samaritan function of being a physician gets lost in the science, and yet it's terribly, terribly important. So that's what I mean by the ministry of healing. I'm convinced that when a physician sees a patient, when the physician examines the patient, this is a ritual. This is an incredibly important ritual. Rituals, we learn from our anthropology colleagues, rituals are about transformation. We marry with great ceremony to signal a transformation. We are baptized in a ritual to signal a transformation. The ritual of one individual coming to another and confessing to them things they wouldn't tell their spouse, their preacher, their rabbi, and then even more incredibly, disrobing and allowing touch, which in any other context would be assault. Tell me that that's not a ritual of great significance. And I think that our skills, our ability to examine the patient, our interchange with the patient, should be worthy of that ritual. If we shortchange the ritual by sticking your stethoscope on the nightgown or not being attentive, or you're inputting into the computer while the patient's talking to you, you basically are destroying the opportunity for the transformation. And what is the transformation? It's the sealing of the patient-physician bond. It's that moment when the trust that you are wanting to get from the patient, you've earned it. This is the moment when it all starts to happen. Many students come to medicine and are disappointed when they arrive on the wards and find that the whole transaction in the hospital increasingly revolves around the computer. In fact, the patient in the bed has almost become an icon for the real object of our interest, who's in the computer. So I actually speak of that entity as the eye patient. You know, like the iPhone, iPad, we have the eye patient, and the eye patient is getting fabulous care. So I think for many of these young students, there's a moment of disillusionment when they realize that all the ways that they thought medicine involved the patient increasingly are removed from the patient. And I think the great burden is on us as teachers to show them that, you know, even with all that technology and so on, the process doesn't begin unless you are at the bedside and form a bond. And that's one thing I'm beginning to realize. You can't demonstrate that by lectures. You can't write that in a book. You can only do it an old-fashioned way by discipleship, one student at a time. You know, to spend 45 minutes with a patient, which is what an older patient often needs, you're not reimbursed as much as if you were doing something to the patient that involves 5 minutes. So we have all these perverse incentives that have in turn created structures to sort of milk that money, if you will. So if you've wondered about surgical centers and outpatient this and outpatient center for that, those are all built around reimbursement phenomenon. So I think the money hasn't been there to spend time with the patient. And if we don't also reform payment such that we celebrate the primary care physician, celebrate that first encounter, celebrate the primacy of the relationship and pay for it, we will not get anywhere. I'm so impressed with our students who, to a man and woman, want to be abroad doing work in resource-poor countries, and it truly expands their consciousness. It's really good for them. They quickly realize how dependent they've become on these technologies and how lost they can be in, you know, a refugee camp setting in, you know, wherever the latest crisis is, and there are people lined up around the block. You know, you have to use your skills to pick out the 6 patients in the line of 100 who deserve a bed and a procedure or something to relieve their suffering. You know, that kind of skill doesn't become evident in a place where, you know, you have abundance of technology and incentives to keep using that technology. You know, there's a lot of money to be made by testing. Life is incredibly poignant because life is not endless. We die, and you only have a certain amount of time to accomplish what it is you want to accomplish. And so it's really important to, you know, try to define what that is you're trying to accomplish and to aim high. So I think it's, you know, in many ways it's probably a universal religious concept, the idea of the body as being sacred and the idea of your being given certain talents to execute. So I'm not sure it characterizes every medical aspect, but it's something I would wish on all young people. And as a father of 3 boys, you know, it's not easy to convey to them the urgency that you feel for them quickly defining their life mission, and, you know, not to become the stereotyped father who's driving them to med school or law school, but more a sense of helping them realize how great their potential can be, not to aim for 3 blind mice when they could be playing, you know, a Bach sonata or something. One of the conceits of medicine, of being in medicine, when you first start learning about the body, you're just sort of overwhelmed at the beauty of it, the harmony, the complexity of these organ systems that all manage to talk to each other. It gives you this almost a sense of, you know, everything's about the body. You know, nothing else really matters, you know. You could explain Civil War, Revolution, Napoleon, Hitler, all through aberrations of the body. I think that you cannot be a physician and not see yourself in the patient's illness. You can't do that with abandonment. It would just sort of incapacitate you. But I think we've made too much of this business of remove from the patient, you know. I don't think you need remove. I think you need to put yourself in the patient's shoes, and then you begin to appreciate how they might actually feel. I mean, obviously one can't do this and jeopardize decision making. So as best you can, you've got to keep enough remove to do that at the right times, you know. Someone collapses in front of you in the airport, it's not a time to be empathizing with the family and worrying about the pet dog that's already been loaded on the airplane. This actually happened to me. It's a time to be worried about airway, breathing, circulation. But other times, it becomes terribly important. And I think one of the joys of being a physician is, you know, I have a sense of when I wake up every morning that, you know, any day above ground is a perfect day. Any day above ground is a success, you know. I mean, that doesn't mean I don't get down, but I just have to think for 5 seconds about what I just saw yesterday or the day before. And I have this immediate sense of, I can think of thousands of people who trade, the way I'm feeling for what they are now feeling. So that's what I was getting at, that you're always seeing yourself in your patients. Medicine is a very powerful way of dealing with your woundedness, your sense of not okayness. There's this sense that I'm going to trade in my insecurities for this, this commitment to a profession, and in return for the great honor of, being able to carry out this profession and the privilege it gives me, I will take care of my own woundedness, which I think is often true. I think it becomes a powerful vehicle for physicians to become excellent doctors. I think it can also sometimes be a double-edged sword. So very often one gets so caught up in the physicianhood that everything about the rest of one's life falls apart. You hear so many cliches of enormously successful physicians who, whose personal lives are complete messes. And it's almost as though if you take that too far, you're saying, well, being a physician gives me a free pass on doing the things I need to do as a father, as a brother, as a child, all the things that we need to do. Yeats has a wonderful poem called The Choice. And it says, the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or perfection of the work. And if it forgoes the latter, must forgo a heavenly mansion raging in the dark. So I think those are the choices, the perfection of the life and perfection of the work. But it's really not a choice. I think it's more like two carriages on parallel tracks, and at any one time in your life you can't afford to let one get too far ahead. You've got to keep them both closely matched if you can. And frankly, I think physicians are notorious for not doing that very well. I don't know that there's many other professions that you can enter into where, in a funny way, your solace comes from, now that you've taken on this covenant to serve others, that's where your solace comes. It might be very much at the root of people entering priesthood or becoming nuns. There's a strong sense that I've made this commitment, bride of Christ, or the celibacy of a priest. This is what I'm giving up. This is my sign of my commitment, in return for which I'm getting, I don't know what, absolution, an exalted state in society, power, authority. It has the potential to be both salvation and seduction. One of the great joys for me living in this world of science at Stanford, a world of basic research, is finally coming to this moment where it seems as though we found the science to support the kind of humanism, ministry of healing that many of us instinctively felt was the right way to do things. We're learning that the placebo effect is so much more than just a sugar pill. We're learning that you can have a powerful effect on patients, or a powerful negative effect on patients, based on context, based on your tone of voice, based on whether the therapy was administered in the hospital or at home. And we're learning that these effects you have on patients are not just feeling good moments, they are actually associated with significant chemical changes in the brain. The Parkinson's patient's dopamine levels go up with a placebo. The patient who's given a placebo anesthesia or anesthetic and no longer feels pain can have that blocked by naloxone, which is a opiate blocking drug. So placebo is no longer this sort of sense of tricking the patient. Far from it. It's a very powerful neurobiological effect with measurable chemical changes, which is making us realize that 30 to 40% of the effect we have on people comes from this context, from this tone of voice, from the ceremony and habits we're using. And it sort of made me sort of have new ammunition to push for ceremony, to push for ritual, to push for the primacy of that physician-patient encounter, and not to feel for a moment that, oh, since I have the test that can, demonstrate whether you have this, I don't need to talk to you. I can just send you for the test and you'll be just as satisfied. No, you won't. We're learning about nocebo, the opposite of placebo. If I frame things in a certain context, you can have more pain, more discomfort, poorer results than if I had framed it in a neutral or positive way. So that emerging science, I think, plays very well into my long-standing belief that this is very much a ministry. It has ceremonial functions that are sustaining to us as physicians, but also tremendously important to the patient. And these rituals we play are associated with transformations that should not have changed from antiquity. If anything, in this sort of postmodern world with all its hasty interactions, they've become more important than ever. The very things that patients want, which is to be inclusive of them, to be empathetic, to include family, to reach out to their connections, to have ceremony, to have ritual, to have a sacred space, you know. Yes, it's nice that the science is catching up with it. I'm really excited by that. But I think that that was always, to me, the great draw of medicine. And we haven't been framing it correctly to our own students. We haven't even framed it to ourselves that way. We have sort of bought into that complete, you know, scientific bench-to-bedside model, all of which is terribly important, and forgotten that the ritual, the ceremony are really completely central to it. There's a riddle that I use in the book as a riddle that, you know, recurs, and it could almost be a metaphor for what we're getting at, which is, and the riddle is something one physician asks another: what treatment in an emergency is administered by air? And the answer is words of comfort. You know, and at one level that might seem like a cute thing to say, but the point is, we're now able to show that the words of comfort trigger biological reactions, which are the very things that you want, and you can use drugs to get there, or you can use words of comfort to get there, which would make your drugs so much more effective. It's an incredible insight in, you know, a couple of decades now of practicing medicine. It's lovely to come full circle to where I started, but with the science to back it up.